I wanted to thank Jessica for inviting me to give you all this presentation, and to thank all of you for listening, and also for the work that you do to preserve and protect sites, without which the work that I'm talking about today, and also a lot of the other work that I do, couldn't have happened. And I wanted to give you a little more background on me. I started my academic and professional career as an archaeologist in the Southwest. It was my first love. When I was 4, I told my parents I wanted to be an archaeologist, and I did it, and sort of through accident and just sort of the complexities of academic life, I became a landscape ecologist and a fire ecologist, but have always tried to integrate archaeological data and projects into the work I do. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is an example of that. And is everything still working right? Audio, video? Okay, perfect.
That's great.
Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you about today is based on a project that's ongoing in the Jemez Mountains, that's about sort of reconstructing human influence on fire regimes and forests. But it's also a project about, it's broader in concept. It's a way of thinking about the landscapes of today through the lens of the past. And my personal belief, and that of other ecologists and archaeologists, is that the landscape that we see today has been shaped by many, many centuries or millennia of human activity on the landscape. And so we know that in the past 100 years or more, there have been some very dramatic consequences of land management and of the human footprint on the landscape. But many people believe, and I think it's true, that that footprint extends much deeper in time. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. I can get these slides to work. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about humans and fire in prehistory, just give you some examples. So the idea that humans may have influenced landscapes, and in particular, kind of the way that fire is expressed on a landscape, isn't particular to the Southwest, and it's not a new concept. As early as the 40s, people were recognizing that things like the grasslands of North America were created, or at least maintained, by fires that people set. We have examples from the Southeast, from Missouri, of the frequency of fire on the landscape being influenced by humans. In New Zealand, you all may have heard of the idea that the forests of New Zealand were dramatically altered by humans in prehistory. We see it in the Pacific Northwest. We see it in California. And then there are some examples from sort of the other side of that spectrum, where people have looked at Yosemite Valley and tried to find evidence of human set fires and haven't found it. And then there's this idea in the southwestern US that Craig Allen wrote about in the early 2000s, with this sort of famous statement of lots of lightning, plenty of people, where he didn't really detect or didn't posit a role of humans in altering landscape scale fire regimes. And so anyway, so we have some perspectives from both sides. And I'll give you my perspective on our project results in a minute. But I want to talk first about why we might care about how humans in prehistory interacted with the environment. And then in particular, why we might care about why humans may have interacted with fire on the landscape. The first is just sort of basic understanding of what human impacts may have been over long time scales. So recognizing that human land use, human resource use, the human footprint on the landscape influenced what we see today. When we look at forest and fire regimes of today, we want to be able to detect what sort of the contemporary patterns are of land management, of wildland urban interface expansion, of fire suppression, of climate change, and kind of distinguish those from things that happened in the past. So account for those past human influences. There are ways that ecological data sources that are useful for reconstructing the forests of the past and the fire regimes of the past. archaeological information can augment those data sources. So in many cases, it's older information than we can get from tree rings. Sometimes it's older information than we can get from soil cores, but archaeological information hasn't been a really integral part of physical sciences until recently. And so if we can sort of extend our understanding of natural and human dynamics earlier into prehistory, we increase our understanding of ecological systems. And also, and I think this is really important to think about, and maybe if we have time for discussion, we can talk about it. We can use this study of human environment interactions in prehistory to think about how those lessons of the past might be incorporated into contemporary fire and land management. So in other words, if the landscapes of today are influenced by past land management, what people were doing on the ground, 1,000 years ago, that history surely has a role in shaping the landscapes that we're trying to manage. And so how do we use that information going forward to try to do a better job of maintaining forests, overcoming or mitigating or addressing the challenges of contemporary land management? So the study area where we'll be focusing today is the Jemez Mountains. So the west side of the Jemez. This is a photo of, you can see Redondo Peak in the background. It's a beautiful landscape. You're hopefully familiar with it through some of your work. It's an incredibly culturally rich landscape. It's also a landscape that's been heavily influenced by wildfires over the past couple decades. And the most notable of those is the Las Conchas fire. That's this photo that you're seeing on the left. So one of the largest fires in New Mexico history, but also one of a fire with an extremely large high severity component. And a high severity fire is one that kills a lot of trees, basically, which is not the natural fire regime for this part of the Southwest for ponderosa pine forests. Our ponderosa pine forests are adapted to burn in low severity fire that kills very few trees, burns on the surface, not a crown fire. These ponderous pine trees survive fire through a number of adaptations and persist through time, even when fires are burning, or because fires are burning every 3 to 5 to 7 years. In contrast, today we see we have a lot of fuel on the ground. We have really dry conditions. We have forests that are very dense. They've been logged. They've grown back in these dog hair thickets, which is the photo on the bottom right. We've lost the sort of open park-like stands with grassy understory that carried that surface fire, which is the picture on the top right. And so we get this very different fire regime on the landscape. We know from looking at archaeological sites, and you may have seen this in your work, that those sites can be heavily impacted and damaged by these high severity fires. So whereas, a site that's been a field house or a room block that's been on the ground for, 1,000 years, has been repeatedly burned, and these low severity fires may look relatively unchanged. In the aftermath of one high severity fire, we have spalling, we have cracking, we have crazing, we have all kinds of effects to architecture and lithics and ceramics. And those are really different than were there before the fire. So we know that there's something very uncharacteristic about these fires. So again, this is an extremely culturally rich landscape. It has one of the highest densities of sites anywhere in the Southwest. You can see some examples of those sites in the photos on the left at the top. We have a standing wall, which is not uncommon in a field house. We have timbers that are architectural timbers on the ground. We know people were cutting and using trees for building. And then on the lower photo on the left, we have a field house, so 1 to 3 room structures with these characteristic rubble mounds that are distributed all over the landscape. They weren't necessarily all used for fields, but had varied purposes. So in the map that you're looking at, so this is the distribution, the accumulation of sites from about 1200 to 1700 And the gray dots are those field houses I talked about, and the red dots are those larger pueblos or room blocks. And so it's hard to imagine how this many people could be living and building things. And of course, they didn't all do it all at the same time, but how you could have this much human settlement on the landscape and not see an influence on fire regimes and forests. Because of course, when people are on the ground, they're using fuel wood for a variety of or using forest materials for a variety of different purposes, for fires, for cooking, for making ceramics. They're clearing land for agriculture. They're making trails. They're doing various activities that change how trees and fuels and fire are all distributed across the landscape. So the signature of people on the Jemez Mountains landscape is, of course, not limited to the past. We have all kinds of effects of people, through the thousands of years of occupation of this landscape. So in the inset photo, I'm showing there the effects of erosion. So there was a large, long episode of sheep grazing that destabilized a lot of the vegetation, the understory, herbaceous vegetation of this landscape, and caused massive erosion. So that's evident, and you can see this pedestaling. So here's architectural stone and some lithics that are basically, 6 inches atop what was what's the current soil level. So, that much soil mass has washed off a lot of the landscape. We have high cut stumps. That's the stump in the foreground. That's showing evidence of early logging. We have woody fuels on the ground, logs that wouldn't have been there if the natural fire regime were present. We have fire rings. We have archaeological site with the datum rings, and then we have changes in forest structure. So shade tolerant trees like Douglas fir that are able to grow in when fires are excluded from this landscape. So we have a lot of complicated signals of humanity to disentangle, to understand how fires and forests and people interacted in the past. So the principal question of the project that encompasses this research, and also sort of the general research question of people and ecosystems through time, is how people, prehistoric people in southwestern landscapes, lived in environments that were fire prone and fire dependent, meaning that fire was an important and integral part of the functioning of essentially healthy forests, how they lived in those environments at high population densities. At one point, the prehistoric population density of the Jemez Mountains was greater than around the city of London for the same time. So how did people live in these high population densities for centuries, didn't appear to destabilize or cause loss of resilience in these forests, when over the past 100 years or so, through our contemporary management activities and settlement practices, we've basically struggled or failed to maintain natural fire regimes and functioning ecosystems. So what were people doing in the past at these high population densities versus what we do today, and how can we sort of reconcile those two perspectives or approaches of land management? So that's where this project comes in, called FIRE, Fire and Humans in Resilient Ecosystems. And as Jessica, I think, mentioned in the introduction, we're talking about this talk, really the key component of this project is that it's multidisciplinary. So we have a team of archaeologists, of ethnographers, of ecologists, ecological modelers, fire ecologists, dendrochronologists, people who study tree rings and fire scars. And we came together to bring all of those lines of evidence to bear on this question of human environment interactions through deep time. So we're looking at what we call the ancient Jemez Wui, or wildland urban interface, from about 1200 to 1900. One of the hallmarks of the the past is, of course, we don't exactly know how many people were on the landscape, what they were doing in terms of how they used resources, when they used those resources, how much of those resources they used. And so ecological modeling, which is what I do, can be a really valuable way to incorporate sort of multiple scenarios of anthropological land use to try to sort of dial in what those characteristics of population size, wood use, fire activity by humans may have been. And so that's what I'm going to show you in these some of the results in the following slides. But I wanted to tell you all about some of the work that the ethnography component of this project revealed. And that was this idea that there are many, many uses for fuels and for fire that existed in the prehistory of this Jemez Mountains area. That the Hamish people, through interviews and other kinds of information gathering processes through this project, identified basically 27 ways in 4 zones that people interacted with fuels and with fire. So everything from hearth activities around a home, to village level activities, to fire and fuels activities in fields, out to a landscape scale. And so that really demonstrated to us that there was this capacity of people to have an effect on fire regimes and forests. And so this ethnographic exploration of fuels and fire became really important to the project. So again, one of my areas of research is to use ecological modeling to try to understand how fire regimes and forest ecology occur at landscape scales. And so I used a model called FireBGC to look at the various ways in which populations of people using different amounts of resources may have influenced fires on the landscape and forest structure and composition. So on the left, I'm showing you my this modeling study area. The black outline is what I call the human footprint on the landscape. You can see that it encompasses that distribution of field houses and Pueblo sites that I showed in an earlier slide, and it's surrounded by this landscape of the Valles Caldera National Preserve, Bandelier National Monument. We have Jemez Pueblo lands and Forest Service lands. And so I embedded this cultural landscape in this sort of more unmodified landscape. It's a landscape that's quite varied in terms of its vegetation that's largely driven by elevation, temperature, and precipitation. So at lower elevations, that's in the upper right, to pinyon juniper woodlands in a tan color. We have middle elevation ponderosa pine forest. And as we get to the higher elevations around the Valles Caldera, we have wet mixed conifer forests. So some Douglas fir, some white fir, some spruce fir forests. And so each of those forest types has a different sort of sensitivity to fire and a different way that fire moves through those forests. And of course, each of those different ecological types also had a different sort of value or to prehistoric peoples, and a different distribution of sites and resource use with them. So it's a pretty complicated picture to disentangle. On top of that, we have this, so this graph on the bottom is the Palmer Drought Severity Index reconstruction. It's basically a reconstruction of the droughtiness through time of the Jemez Mountains. And so imposed on this ecological complexity is this climate signal that goes up and down. And of course, climate was a huge driver of, is a huge driver of vegetation patterns, but also a huge driver of the success or failure or the movements or the population size, the resource use of people on the landscape. So that becomes an additional complicating factor. And as I mentioned before, we don't know perfectly how many people were living in the Jemez Mountains in the past. So we have high and low population estimates that factor into this modeling work. That's what I'm showing in these blue and orange bars. So for each time period that we identified, which come from Jeremy Kulishek's dissertation work in the Jemez Mountains, and I'm showing the citation for that over toward the right. We have an estimate of a sort of a lower end of what population may have been, and then an upper end. And so I hope you can see going through time that settlement patterns started out sort of in a minimal area of that footprint with a low population size, sort of crescendoing in this 1450s to 1600s period to the highest populations, and then tapering off again toward the 1700s. And so those relative population sizes, high versus low, are pretty important in terms of how people may have been using resources. And can you all still hear me? Everything good?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to apologize to you for just the difficulty in trying to explain these modeling results. It's always sort of a challenge, but if you bear with me, and please feel free, I can't see your the chat window the way my screen is, but if you want to break in with any questions at any point, I'm happy to answer them. But basically, I want to talk about these scenarios that we developed to try to assess the ways in which these different populations of people with different potential strategies for resource use may have influenced fires in forests. So I call these archaeological scenarios. So I talked about low versus high population. Those numbers were reconstructed from the potential occupation of pueblos and field houses through time. The time periods of occupation were identified by ceramic seriation. So basically the chronologies for ceramic assemblages at sites through time, trying to tie occupation to one time period versus another. That's a relative dating method, so we have some uncertainty. So I looked at, again, low population versus high population. We don't know how much fuel wood people used. There are examples in the literature of for similar elevations for reflecting how much wood people would have had to use to heat their homes, and then to do cooking and fire ceramics of kind of on the lower end of fuel wood use, maybe a cord per person per year, and on the higher end 2 cords per person per year. A lot of that information comes from the Dolores Archaeological Project that did a lot of reconstruction of fuel wood use. It's been well documented in literature around the world, and also here in the Southwest, that people used ignitions to clear land for agriculture, to perhaps herd game, to eliminate invasive weeds, to clear trails. And so we think that people probably augmented natural lightning ignitions, but we don't know by how much. We know that people cut large logs for building. You saw some of those in the photos, and you can see some architectural timbers in the lower photo. So I had a scenario in which people removed one large log per person per year, basically. And then we know that some combination of ignitions and agriculture were present on the landscape for land clearing, but again, we don't really know how much. So I scaled these scenarios to population size. So basically, if there were 5,000 people on the landscape at any one time, each of those people in this low fuel wood scenario required 1 cord per person, et cetera. So everything's multiplied by population to try to get these estimates of how resource use may have differed by these population sizes. So those scenarios are what are shown in these individual panels along the bottom of your screen. I'm showing in particular here how those scenarios sort of result in changes in fuel wood availability and fuel wood use, just as an example here to get us started. So the red line is the target fuel wood that would have been necessary for those populations under those scenarios. The blue line is what in this modeling work was actually removed by the prehistoric population in this landscape. And so as you move across these panels from the upper left to the upper right, the lower left to the lower right, we're increasing the resource use of these populations. So we're saying there are more people, they're using the landscape more intensively. And when we get to the high population scenario where people are harvesting structural fuel wood and adding ignitions to clear land for agriculture, we start to see that basically that resource use is exceeding the availability of fuel wood on the ground. And that's a really important point because it implies sort of the ecological carrying capacity of this landscape for fuels, which are essential for cooking, for heating, for firing ceramics, that people are starting to exceed that, which could be a factor in why we would see expansion of people within and outside that human footprint. And that's been suggested elsewhere in the literature. So again, the sort of the ecological carrying capacity of the landscape in terms of fuel wood is exceeded at those higher resource use and population levels. So if we want to look at how that plays out across this human footprint on the landscape, you can look at this really complicated series of maps. So on the toward the top, along the top, we have increasing land and resource use, and then along the y-axis, so the vertical series of maps, we have increasing time or increasing occupation periods from the early occupation, small population, through the early Jemez, late Jemez, or peak population numbers, and then tapering off. And so the green areas of those maps show places where fuel wood is still available in that scenario, in that time period. And red is where basically all the fuel wood that could be available has been harvested from that landscape. So again, in those high resource use scenarios, and especially when we have high numbers of people, large numbers of people on the landscape, there's an enormous effect of people in terms of their fuel wood harvest. So basically, sticks on the ground, logs on the ground, low branches and trees, small trees are all harvested for fuel wood. So if you can imagine in the forests of today, if that were true, if in that same footprint, all of the available combustible fuel were removed, you can imagine that would have an enormous influence on the potential for fire to burn on the landscape, and then also in the way that fire burned on the landscape. And in fact, that's what we see in this model. So here I'm showing some graphs that demonstrate in this model what the human influence was on fire regimes. I'm going to walk through these because they're pretty important. So in this panel A, that's in the upper left, I'm showing the amount of area burned in that landscape, in the Jemez Mountains landscape, under two different scenarios. One is assuming that there were no people on the landscape. So no harvesting, no extra ignitions, no agriculture. This would be sort of the area burned in the absence of any kind of human interaction. And then so that's the gray bars. And then the orange bars are what that same variable, in this case, area burn, looks like when we have humans basically using the land intensively. So collecting fuel wood, adding ignitions, clearing land for agriculture. And we see, and then along the bottom, we have time, and I've circled in red there that period of highest population size. So sort of highest resource use and intensity, the greatest area influenced in that landscape. And so we don't see much difference between a scenario where we don't have any humans doing things in the landscape and where we have this intensive use, except for this period of large population from 1300s to the 1600s. And there we see that area burned when humans play a role is larger than if humans don't. So that sounds like it might be sort of a bad thing for ecosystems, right? Except that not all fire is the same, as you probably know. So if we look at panel B, we're looking at fire size. And again, we don't see an enormous difference between the gray and the orange bars, humans, no humans, except when we look at that same 1300s to 1600s period, where we see that fire size, when humans were interacting with the landscape, is much smaller. And that's because all of these activities that humans did on the landscape fragmented the fuels. So instead of being this sort of continuous carpet of fuels across an enormous, many tens of thousands of acres, we see fuels that are interrupted by non-burnable surfaces like trails or fields or pueblos themselves, which are, were probably cleared and trampled and have a big apron of non-burnable ground around them, have been heavily harvested because people take resources from close by them first. And so all of those things restricted the size of fires that could burn on the landscape. Looking at panel C, and here are the sort of the important things in terms of ecology. Again, we don't see much difference between no humans and humans, except for that period of really the 1300s, 1600s periods of high population density, large population numbers, where we see that fire intensity is much, much, much lower when humans are interacting with fuels and forests. And the same thing is true with tree mortality. And so I put these pictures in the right to show you all what the difference is between a high intensity fire that kills a lot of trees and a low intensity surface fire. So on the upper photo, it's a much higher intensity fire than on the lower photo. And so that's sort of the difference there that we'd be looking at: fires that kill trees versus fires that don't. We want to see how those patterns of fire play out in space. This is looking just at this late Jemez phase, the absolute peak occupation at several different scenarios. The red colors indicate more frequent fires on the landscape. More frequent fires are what fit with our tree ring reconstructions, tree ring and fire scar reconstructions of what fire would have been like on this landscape. And we actually don't start to see a fire history pattern that agrees with the fire scar record from trees until we add in those extra human ignitions and sort of fuel and resource interactions that we get with, say, the panels on the bottom row. So, and the time series graph, this is before 1680, fewer widespread fires and more small fires. So that's a graph that comes from the tree ring record. And so essentially what I'm showing you here is that the spatial pattern of fires on the landscape and the fire frequency on the landscape best matches the tree ring record when we add in this human interaction. So we can't burn fires in the landscape without changing vegetation, because of course vegetation is the fuel that burns, and trees are sensitive to fire, both in terms of the survival of existing trees and then the regeneration of forests after fire. So again, this is a graph showing these different scenarios of population and resource use from a no human scenario, that's null. And then as we move through low population, low fuel wood, that's LP, LF. If you sort of track down through the individual graphs all the way to high population, structural fuel wood, SF, high ignitions in agriculture, that follows this pattern of resource use from low to high intensity. And it's not really until we get to those high population, high resource use scenarios that we start to see vegetation patterns in this modeled world that look pretty similar to what we expect from reconstructions of fire history and sort of forest patterns on the landscape. So the iconic kind of stand structure for ponderosa pine forests in the Jemez Mountains is of these open park-like stands with a grassy understory. So fewer trees, but big trees, in contrast to the dog hair sort of thickets of small trees that we see in many places today, but with this grass understory that carried fire frequently across the landscape. And so in these graphs, we have time that's going across on the x-axis, and then we have a proportion of the landscape on the y-axis, the vertical axes of these graphs showing what the vegetation is in each of those time periods. So red is grass, and green is ponderosa pine. Those are probably the two most important colors to pick out. And again, it's not until we model this pretty significant human interaction with resources and through fire use and fuel harvesting that we start to see a vegetation pattern that looks like what we expect it to from ecological reconstructions. So I want to reflect a little bit on what the significance of these results is when we incorporate an archaeological perspective into forest and fire ecology, what that means, and what it means for how we think about and manage landscapes of today. So first, I hope that I've demonstrated to you that the human influence on fire regimes and forests is important, and in fact, maybe exists as a sort of a counterpoint to this idea of naturalness that that can be an assumption when we don't incorporate archaeological information, that naturalness being this idea that maybe there was a lesser role of humans on the landscape than maybe is the case here in the Southwest. Thinking back to the question of our project about how people may have lived in the Jemez Mountains for such a long time without really degrading the ecological resilience of those ecosystems. I think the answer is that humans lived with fire either through, well, first of all, because without the impacts of warming and drying climate and fuel accumulation, fires were of lower intensity and they killed fewer trees. They were sort of less scary than the fires of today, but also because the forests and the regeneration of forests in the Southwest are dependent on fire, and where humans may have collected fuel wood and fragmented the landscape and restricted fires, they also set fires for agricultural uses, for land clearing, for herding game, for all the reasons that I suggested. And so even as they removed the fuels that serve to carry fires across the landscape, they were also adding ignitions. And that's something that we don't do today, of course. I mean, we often, we've minimized the role that fire plays on the landscape. So it's an idea that you can think of as humans as fire surrogates. So recent land use and management have, in contrast, destabilized forests. We are only at a very small scale on the landscape, acting as fire surrogates through fuel treatments or starting fires for management, and as in the case of prescribed fires. More often, there's a response to wildfires that burn in a way that aren't particularly sustainable for forests. And so So the question is, what can we learn from the past that would help us manage these landscapes for the future? So what can we learn about the role of people on these landscapes that can help us into the future? And I think one of the major take homes for me is that the scale of manipulation or the scale of land management in the past was actually really significant, was really broad, was across, probably a greater area than that human footprint that I showed, but almost certainly there was enormous interaction of people with forest and with fire throughout that area. And so I want to leave you this question about something to think about when you're out walking on the landscape, and that's just the idea of what is natural. So if we subtract the signal of the past 100 years of land management and of wildland urban interface and settlement patterns that are the most obvious on the landscape, does that mean that we are looking at a natural landscape? And of course, as archaeologists and people who are interested in archaeology, your answer is probably no. But for many people, it's a really unique perspective to think that 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago, people were interacting with the landscape in a way that could have a lasting impact, or could be as significant as the type of effect that people have today, but maybe significant in a different way, significant in a way that's more sustainable than we see today. So these are photo pairs that Tom Swetnam has produced, contrasting landscapes of the 1880s with those that we see today. And in this case, none of these photos represent a natural landscape. And what I'll leave you with is this idea that there is not a photograph that could capture a truly natural landscape, because we have millennia of human interaction to account for. And with that, I'll end. This work was supported by National Science Foundation. We continue to try to get funding to expand the work that we're doing. You can see my collaborators here on the screen. And also, if you have interest in this project, in addition, I have Archaeology Southwest summarize this project, and I think there are copies floating around. If you're interested, I can try to find one for you. Just let me know. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Rachel. That was a really awesome talk. I think that we have one quick question from Mark Henderson, and I'm just going to read it. And then we also have another one from Ann Beckett. It says, would it be useful if site stewards noted vegetation type and condition on the reports as a fire risk hazard? If so, what vegetation types might be particularly noted? And how might density, there's some parenthetical stuff here, and how might density, for example, how do we measure a little cheatgrass versus a lot, and report on phenology, emergent seeds heads, and cured out? So what's important to note?
So that's a good question. So for the modeling work that I talked about today, part of the reason to use a model was that we sort of had to use it to erase or to sort of model backwards from all of the 21st, 20th century forest structure and fire effects that we see today. So recording vegetation on sites of today doesn't necessarily feed into this modeling work, but you mentioned in the introduction that, and part of my work is on fire effects on existing cultural resources, and for those, knowing the fuel condition at sites and also whether there are fire effects already present at sites is extremely important. And I can't answer that question. I can't tell you what you should record right now because it's part of a longer conversation, but I guess I had never thought that site stewards might aid in this fire effects project. But if you all are interested in recording fuel types and whether there are fire effects present on these sites that you monitor, we could come up with a form for you all to do that. And that information would be incredibly valuable. First, because it's really important to know when sites have already been affected by fire and where they haven't been. And second, of course, to note what the fuels are that might pose a risk if a fire were to burn. So that's a great question. And I would be really, really happy to interact with you all to try to come up with a form to record that information. And I think people from the forest and NPS and whomever should be part of that conversation, but could also be really, really interested. So yeah, just let me know.
Okay. We will go ahead and let's see. We'll continue that. I'll figure out a way how to do that.
Okay. Yeah.
Let's see. And then somebody asked.
Oh yeah, I can see that one. How
okay.
I chose to start with. So that's just the earliest period where we had a population size that we could reconstruct that was likely to be large enough to interact with resources on the ground. So that's that early occupation period. Vallecitos, it's called. People were restricted to kind of lower elevation, ponderosa pine sites. And so we started there. There were almost certainly people on the landscape, moving in and out and around before that particular period, but that was the most reliable early population estimate that we could get.
Okay, great. Are there any more questions? All right. Well, I think that we're, thank you for coming and speaking to us, Rachel. And I think we're probably ready to segue to lunch and also to breakout rooms for those who have signed up for breakout room 1 and anybody who wants to